Thank you for joining me for this Scrum Foundation series discussion of velocity. In order to provide you with an introduction to velocity, we'll discuss what velocity is, we'll talk about the benefits it provides, the essential disciplines required to use it, how to establish velocity, and how to track velocity. To set the stage, it is important to recognize that Scrum is a framework. Although the framework is non-prescriptive, it is essential that the implementation satisfies its tenets and guidelines. Each of the individual components of the framework combine to produce the benefits of its implementation. Velocity is simply a tool teams can use in order to satisfy essential parts of the larger Scrum ecosystem, without which the impact of using Scrum would be largely diminished. Its effectiveness amplifies in combination with other tools derived to satisfy the framework. Examples include backlog management, decoupling of relative and absolute estimates utilizing story points, release planning, team composition consistency, effective retrospectives, and metrics collection and utilization of those metrics. Velocity in Scrum is broadly recognized by the industry as a measure of the amount of work a team completes within a sprint. In his book Essential Scrum, Ken Rubin defines velocity as the rate at which work is completed per unit time. Remember that velocity is simply one way to satisfy the framework defined in the Scrum Guide, which does not prescribe the use of velocity specifically. Instead, it simply states that the more the developers know about their past performance, their upcoming capacity, and their definition of done, the more confident they will be in their sprint forecasts. For example, cycle time is an example of an alternative to velocity for measuring past performance. Cycle time measures the amount of time a team works in order to complete a product backlog item. When measuring velocity, teams typically use units called story points. It should be noted that story points are not the only estimation unit utilized by Scrum teams, although they are the most popular. There are two key concepts to recognize with respect to story points or any other measurement unit applied to velocity. First, story points are a measure of team output. In other words, a story point represents a quantity of delivered value generated by the Scrum team. The other key concept is relative estimation. Story points do not directly equate to hours. Instead, they represent a relative size measured against other product backlog items. Using story points for estimation allows for the consideration of the amount of work, risk, complexity, and uncertainty involved. Velocity brings benefits to teams in two major areas: planning and improvement. From a planning perspective, velocity translates into time based on the key Scrum tenet that a sprint represents a fixed time duration. As a result, the number of story points delivered in a sprint reflects a delivery rate of points per unit time. The other major benefit is that a team can use velocity data to determine how it is performing. Velocity can be reviewed at the sprint retrospective in order to set the stage for improvement discussions. A decrease in velocity over time is an indication of issues such as low quality resulting from too many bugs, which erode the team's capacity to produce value. As the team implements improvements such as CI/CD, automated testing, environment standardization, or architectural changes, the effectiveness of the improvements can be determined by measuring the increase in velocity. There are a few key disciplines that teams must strive for in order to maintain the effectiveness of velocity. Since velocity is measured in relative units, translation to time is critical. If the sprint time box is changed, it is difficult to translate velocity metrics to a value delivery rate. A common anti-pattern experienced by Scrum teams is the tendency to equate a point to a specific amount of time, such as thinking of a point as a day's worth of work. Doing so erodes the focus of value delivery and essentially eliminates any benefit of using velocity at all. Stories with large point values should be avoided. The higher the point value, the higher the risk of not completing the story within the sprint time box. High point values are an indication that stories may not be ready for implementation. large stories also erode the usefulness of historical velocity because the likelihood of not completing the work in a single sprint increases, resulting in carryover of work from sprint to sprint. If a team commits to more work than it can complete in a sprint, the impact is an erosion of focus. If a sprint backlog is too large, prioritization and interdependencies increase, resulting in less efficiency. In the end, overcommitment usually results in more stories in progress and less stories completed. The Scrum Master must strive to protect the team from counterproductive uses of velocity metrics. For example, if velocity is used by management to compare teams or to push teams to complete more work than they have capacity for, the teams may have a tendency to overestimate in order to avoid these external side effects. Estimates made in the early stages of a project have a large margin of error. As a project moves into the development stages, estimation accuracy increases. A useful tool to help understand this is the Cohn of uncertainty, which was established by Barry Boehm in 1989 and named by Steve McConnell in 2006. Although it was established around the more traditional waterfall mindset, the concept helps to address planning using a Scrum-centered approach. The approach to estimation evolves over time during a project's lifespan. Just as story points allow for abstraction from absolute time units, ranges of story points can be abstracted to broader estimation units, such as t-shirt sizes. During the initiation and planning stages, the vision is established, teams are formed, and the high-level product backlog is created. At this stage, product backlog items are essentially large user stories that can span an entire release or many months. Typically, a roadmap is created that aligns high-level product backlog items with strategic goals. Project boundaries are usually defined by one of two major constraints: strategic date targets or budget limitations. Since the estimation variability is high during these stages, it is useful to use units like t-shirt sizes. This allows for the eventual mapping of story point ranges once the teams have had the opportunity to establish a baseline for velocity using story points. As the project transitions into the development cycle and the backlog begins to decompose into smaller, more detailed items, the use of story points becomes more relevant. Let's assume that your project has matured through initiation and product planning. You have a high-level product backlog in place, and shirt sizes have been assigned to the large backlog items. The Scrum team is formed and has been consulted during the creation and estimation of the high-level product backlog. As a result of the exposure to the product vision and initial roadmap, the team has enough of an understanding of the project scope and boundaries to begin working on foundational tasks. This is a good time for the team to accomplish two things with respect to velocity. First, since story points are relative, they need to establish a basis for pointing. Next, they need to estimate their velocity. Teams can establish a story point baseline by simply estimating a few stories of different sizes and assigning point values appropriate for the relative size. From that point forward, all stories will be pointed relatively against the other stories in the backlog. In order to estimate velocity without any historical metrics, the team has two options. If there is time, the team can simply execute a few sprints pulling stories from the backlog in priority order. They can simply capture how many points were completed if they have time. If velocity is needed more quickly, the team can actually estimate a few stories in detail until the total hours estimated equals the hours available in the sprint time box for the team. The total points of the estimated stories will equal the estimated velocity. Velocity tracking is relatively straightforward. Simply keep track of the number of points delivered by the team each sprint. But there are a few things to keep in mind. Only include done backlog items in the velocity. Don't include bugs in the velocity. And strive for consistent team composition. It can also be helpful to track team availability along with points delivered each sprint. Normally, when all team members are available as expected, velocity metrics can be used directly with no issue. But in cases where team members are unavailable for portions of the sprint due to outages or unexpected needs elsewhere, use of raw velocity data can produce inaccurate results. In this case, Team availability can be used to calibrate velocity in order to improve accuracy. That concludes this presentation of Velocity in Scrum. I hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for listening.